Both countries, China and the United States I'm referring to here, and perhaps in Indonesia, if I've been persuasive, there's an unfinished agenda of dealing with the categories of disaster that I've identified. And both of these countries have, as has yours, have devoted a great deal of time and energy to thinking about how to improve the emergency management system. So I think it would be appropriate to think of all three countries as being on a path of development to bring their emergency management systems into the 21st century and to create systems that protect their people, their economies, their ways of life to a much greater degree. Indeed, the failures that are perceived in both countries, say comparing the earthquake and the blizzards, have propelled this movement. It's not coming because it's not coming because of a generalized desire to have better public policy, but because there was great criticism of the government, inability to forecast the damage, weak local government responding poorly to being badly prepared and responding poorly, the widespread perception that the national government was too slow to respond. Indeed, some of these very criticisms about the national government are currently being made of the Obama administration's response to the oil spill and the ongoing oil spill in the. I want to just spend a minute or two talking about this, not because it differs in a great deal from what was described earlier by the BNPB presentation. 5 different points of leverage that we have for reducing the damage from social disasters. So it is not only just a list of good practices, but it is also a list of things where we can thoughtfully decide where are we applying too little energy, too few resources, where might we deploy our resources better. We never have enough resources for all of the needs of the system, but given whatever aggregate amount of money we have, we need to think about how we spend that relative to where do societies spend the money? Probably we worry about having resources to respond when in an earthquake to collapsed buildings. Many different kinds. Here in Indonesia, there was only brief mention of forest fires, but as in the United States, this is a severe problem in Indonesia as well, I understand. So we worry about having enough preparing the capacity to respond, and then we spend a great deal of time and money in response. And in many ways, that's a place where the first attention typically goes. A second place, a third leverage point, is recovery. And I was struck by the budget that was presented that showed this morning, that showed how money is distributed in your system. If I remember the figure correctly, it was about 67% of Indonesian national expenditures in the overall disaster risk reduction area is spent on recovery. And that well illustrates what's true in the United States and China, too, that when there's a huge disaster, we have no choice but to spend a lot of money to help those areas at least get back near where they were before, if not better. Sometimes we don't spend as much as we should, but we are spending huge amounts of money. But one might think that the expenditures on recovery really are a sign of failure as much as an investment in hope. Perhaps we have not done what we could to reduce the damage that a disaster creates. And indeed, the fourth leverage point that's been mentioned is prevention and mitigation. And we could think of this in the Katrina case. It was well known that the levees that prevented Lake Pontchartrain from pouring water into New Orleans, much of the city being below sea level, that those levees were inadequate to withstand the pressures of a very large hurricane. But the amount of money was gigantic. Authority over those levees was divided among some very small units of government, not the major city or state units, and nothing much happened. The result of it is that a couple of $1 billion that could have been spent to repair the levees and prevent their failure, and that would have then prevented the city from flooding, would have cut the recovery in New Orleans, at least, way below, certainly at least an order or two of magnitude from the immense expenses that are now being incurred. There are many ways in which either prevention, which tries to avert an event totally, or mitigation that tries to reduce the damages that it produces could be cost effective. But it's very difficult to generate sufficient political initiative and energy to get mitigation budgets passed. The fifth, so we've talked now about two kinds of preparation. One is, I've just mentioned, prevention and mitigation focus on the event itself. How do we stop it, or how do we make it less severe? Preparation for response says, okay, the event is going to happen. We've got to be able to get out there. We have to rescue people. We have to provide relief to them, shelter, food, etc. How do we do a good job of that? The third kind of pre-event activity that I'm going to speak about has gotten very little attention in the United States, and to the extent I can see, gets almost no attention in China, and that is preparation in advance for recovery. Sometimes people talk about that and say that they're focusing on it, but what they actually describe is a prevention or mitigation impact. It is focusing on the event itself. By advanced recovery, we actually mean things that are assume that the event will occur, assume that it's going to create damage, and but these steps in advance are meant to either make recovery more effective, to make it quicker, or to do it more efficiently with fewer resources. And my research group has been working with both the city of San Francisco in California and the city of Los Angeles, where we're just getting started, to recovery work. Because each of those cities sees a 95% chance of having at least a 6.5 earthquake over the next 20 to 40 months. They're doing many things to mitigate the impacts of earthquakes. But if it occurs, it's still going to create a great deal of damage in two great cities. So they're beginning to think about things that they could do to make the recovery easier, faster, cheaper. What sorts of things are they thinking about? Let me sketch those in. We could talk about them later. One thing they recognize is that the city will need a lot of money, in addition to whatever it might get from the national government, at a time when its ability to borrow money is going to decline precipitously. Who wants to lend money to a city that has so many demands, whose property has decreased in value, that's not going to be collecting as much taxes as it had done before? And so they're beginning to think of ways that will give them access to resources. They are thinking, for example, about forms of insurance that they might purchase, anticipate that the nature of government management will change drastically in the wake of a major earthquake. And so they're asking the question, what would our structure of government look like post-earthquake? We will need to have stronger city development agencies. We will need to have improved housing. We may need better social services. And they're beginning to think of what that structure would look like. How should the mayor's office be reorganized? What would might there be new cabinet committees that would operate in city government? And they are thinking about how to put the legal authority, both to design those things and to put the legal authority in place in advance. The second thing that they're thinking about that's closely related is to consider how the budget of the city of San Francisco, say, might be reallocated post-earthquake. They will not be spending their money in the same way that they did before. Their capital expenditures are bound to change in major ways. Their operating expenses are going to be quite different. They'll have lots of rubble to remove, etc. So they are also beginning to think a bit, what would